let's talk about the crowns that the pharaohs wore in ancient Egypt.
As far as I'm aware, no ancient Egyptian crown has ever been found. Only images of the crowns and accounts of the power of the crowns.
Sorry about the quality of that recording. It was from a lecture he did many years ago. But yes, it is true that no crown has ever actually been found, just these stone renditions of a crown.
The power of the crowns.
Let's start with the dangers of the crowns. To talk about the dangers of the crowns, first of all, you have to understand that there were essentially two, let's say, sets of crowns. There was the set that was for the dynastic Egyptian royalty, and there were the various crowns that were worn, theoretically, by the gods. So the ones that are pictured on the heads of the gods, that's a whole different story, which I think I'm going to have to explain completely separately. But it's the ones that were worn by the actual dynastic royalty that we're going to be talking about. Now, I should note at this point that there is a bit of overlap between these two sets, as quite often you see some of the gods pictured wearing the crowns of the royalty. So having identified the two groups, my next question is, was it the royal crowns or the godly crowns that were the dangerous ones? I believe that the godly crowns were actually symbolic, but the royal crowns were in fact real. But I still don't think that it was the royal crowns per se that were actually dangerous. I think that the ancient dynastic Egyptians actually found one of the headdress items of the ancients, which under certain circumstances would have been dangerous and would have done as described in the myth. Myths aside, let's have a look at the regular everyday crowns that the ancient Egyptian pharaohs were known for. There's three: the white crown, the red crown, and the combined crown. And each had a different, let's say, region. So the red crown was all about Upper Egypt, the white, Lower Egypt, and the combined, obviously, the unification of Egypt. So the combined crown was probably the most important one of them all. I think that they were, in fact, beautifully crafted, very delicate items. So how would they make a white crown? They had this, cone shape, not quite the same shape as a white crown, which I know that sounds a bit weird. It's a bit like a last that a cobbler uses to make shoes. So this was a stone item, and it looked like a cone, really, a fairly plain cone. And they used some kind of gum, and they put it right at the top of this cone. And then they had what I believe must be papyrus, but it looked pretty much like just strips of, very, very thin strips of some kind of, weaving stuff, which, as I said, I think probably was papyrus. And they laid it out crisscross right on the top of this cone thing. Then they started weaving with it, and they weaved all over this stone cone until they had completely covered the cone. And then they did this beautiful edging around the base of this weaving thing. And the end result of that was this tall-looking woven hat. But that's not how it ended up, because what happened next was they took what looked like white paint, and I don't know, maybe it was some kind of plaster, and they kind of painted it on this stuff that they'd woven, and it was kind of wet and a bit, mushy, and they molded it, and they put it on someone's head and just continued shaping it until it was, absolutely perfect. I don't actually know what that paste was that they made the crown from, but I do suspect that it was reasonably combustible, because at the end of the reign of any pharaoh, one of the ceremonies that they had was the burning of the crown. So it meant that it was a demonstration that that era was over and a new one was starting. And I don't know if that's in the history books or anything, but it seems like a pretty simple sort of concept. This, to some extent, does answer part of the question as to why they have never been found. It's because so many of them were, in fact, burnt. But that doesn't provide the answer for all of them. But a pharaoh wouldn't have just had the one crown over a pharaoh's reign. They might have had many crowns. So, why were no crowns ever found? Well, when it comes to the crowns of the gods, they weren't found because they were symbolic. Hence, they never actually existed. When it comes to the crowns of the dynastic Egyptians, they were delicate. They were something that was created very specifically for one person, and they were made in such a way that they would have disintegrated fairly easily. So that's the reason I don't think they exist today. But I do think that they were definitely exactly as they show them on the statues and the depictions on all the walls. They are symbols of power and divinity of the gods. There's just so much more that's captured the imagination and fascinate both historians, Egyptologists, and simply enthusiasts alike. We need to be clear that there are essentially two groups of crowns of ancient Egypt. It's the Egyptian royals' crowns and the crowns or the headdresses of the ancient Egyptian gods. And yes, there is some overlap between these two. You see gods wearing the crowns of royalty, and you also see the royals wearing the crowns of gods when they want to appear to have the same attributes as those gods. But essentially, they are two different groups, and they serve very, very different purposes. Let's start with the crowns of the royals. The first one I'd like to talk about is the red crown, known as the Deshret. This was the crown of Lower Egypt, which is the area closer to the Mediterranean Sea. The Deshret is depicted as a red, let's call it a hat, and the Egyptologists indicate that it's made of cloth or leather, and essentially it's a hat that covers the whole head, and it extends down almost to the shoulders. It has a protruding curved bit at the back and what looks like copper wire, like a little tongue coming out at the front, more like a proboscis. Say it extends down the back of the hat almost as far as the shoulders, What I'm really trying to communicate is that at the back of the hairline, where the hairline ends, is where the actual crown ends. And in fact, it follows the hairline around the whole face. So no hair is exposed. You see many pictures of pharaohs like Nama or Khufu wearing this red crown, and that is to show that they rule over Lower Egypt. And of course, Lower Egypt was the fertile plains, the delta, the area where the silt rested in great abundance, creating very fertile soil. The next crown is the opposite. It is the Hedjet, or the white crown, and it symbolizes Upper Egypt. So that's the southern part of the country, and towards the start of the Nile rather than where the Nile comes out. And it's depicted a bit like a bowling pin. It's shaped with a bulbous tip. It's white, and the bottom of the crown once again follows the hairline of the person and covers the hair completely. The crown's also seen in many ancient carvings and depictions and statues, and it's worn by pharaohs like Mentuhotep II, and he actually reunified Egypt. So he would also wear the next crown that we're going to talk to, which is the combined crown. The double crown is called the Pashent, and it's a combination of the red crown and the white crown, and it symbolizes the unification of the two regions into the one Egypt. It's essentially depicted as the white crown sitting within the red crown, and the red crown's proboscis thing sticking out of the white crown. The unification of the two crowns into this represents the pharaoh's power over the whole of Egypt, and it was a very powerful symbol of unity and of sovereignty. And each of these crowns did hold significant meaning and power in ancient Egypt, serving not just as royal headgear, but as the symbol of their authority, their divine power, and the national unity. When I talk about the divine power, there are stories of the crowns being gifted to the pharaohs to continue the line. According to Wikipedia and other sources, the crown called the Atef is also a royal crown, but I dispute that because from my perspective, that is a god crown, which is a completely different category to me. And it was a theoretical kind of crown. And in fact, I never saw anything like one of those crowns in any of my dream regressions. So I'm going to label it as a god crown. And the god crowns are all about symbolism to the ancient Egyptians. So I'm going to leave that one to the next group of crowns, which I will do a completely different episode on. That doesn't mean that it's it for the royal crowns, because we've also got the beautiful blue war crown of the pharaohs, as well as this kind of skullcap crown and a few other unusual and interesting looking crowns that were worn by royalty. This episode seems to be going on a little bit too long, so I think I need to do a part 3 where I will look at the remaining royal crowns, especially the blue crown of war, which has a lot of significance, and the other miscellaneous interesting looking crowns, before doing a final episode, or even 2, on the interesting, let's call it headwear, of the gods, which were very symbolic. But before I finish this episode, I should really explain the question at the start of this episode, which was, why were none of these crowns ever found? Well, I did an episode a while ago about a dream that I had about one of these crowns being made. So I'm just going to tag that to the end of this episode, because I think that explains it all. The real crowns were actually quite delicate, and at the end of each reign there was a symbolic destruction of the old crown at the same time as the new crown being presented. Hopefully, sometime in the future, the archaeologists will find a record of this and they'll be able to verify what I'm saying is true. So that's why the archaeologists can't find any of these crowns today. But here's a bit of an extract from an episode I did regarding a dream that I had about the making of these crowns. This will give you a feel for just how delicate and lightweight these crowns were. I was watching someone make a white crown, and they had this cone shape, not quite the same shape as a white crown, which I know that sounds a bit weird. It's a bit like a last that a cobbler uses to make shoes. So this was a stone item, and it looked like a cone, really, a fairly plain cone. And they used some kind of gum, and they put it right at the top of this cone. And then they had what I believe must be papyrus, but it looked pretty much like just strips of, very, very thin strips of some kind of, weaving stuff, which, as I said, I think probably was papyrus. And they laid it out crisscross right on the top of this cone thing. Then they started weaving with it, and they weaved all over this stone cone until they had completely covered the cone. And then they did this beautiful edging around the base of this weaving thing. And the end result of that was this tall looking woven hat. But that's not how it ended up, because what happened next was they took what looked like white paint, and I don't know, maybe it was some kind of plaster, and they kind of painted it on this stuff that they'd woven, and it was kind of wet and a bit mushy, and they molded it, and they basically molded it in a way that they pulled the top of it inwards, so it ended up with a bit of a knob on the top. And then they shaped it, and they put it on someone's head and just continued shaping it until it was, absolutely perfect and well balanced, so it was easy to wear and wouldn't fall off. It was nice and secure. And then they packed it with what looked like straw or something dry, and they set it off to one side to dry out. And the end result was this white, beautiful white, well-shaped crown helmet thing. Now, in terms of the red one, I didn't see them making any of those. I just saw them making a white one. But I could read between the lines for that as well, I'm sure, having seen what I've seen. But it's no surprise that no white crowns have been found, because this would have been a relatively delicate item. I wonder if archaeologists have found any weird cone-shaped stone items and wondered what they were. It would be very nice to find out. The enigmatic blue war crown of ancient Egypt. No examples of the blue war crown, nor any other of the royal crowns, has actually ever been discovered. But we do have many statues, we have lots of wall paintings, and that sort of thing of this beautiful crown. But is it actually a crown, or is it just a headdress? This particular aspect is debatable, but for the purpose of this episode, we're going to just call it a crown, because it was worn by the royal as a symbol of their power. This crown was stunning in colour and extremely unusual in shape. You might say the others are pretty unusual in shape too. But what is it about the blue crown? Well, the blue crown was known as the Khepresh, and it was a distinctive headdress worn by the pharaohs during times of battle. But this was mainly during the New Kingdom period, and after that, apparently until the Kushites. But why was it a special crown for war? The royal crowns essentially weren't particularly suitable for any form of exertion because they were lightweight, delicate, and due to their size and complexity, they'd actually been quite difficult to balance while active. Although I must say, looking at Nemes' artwork, it looks like he seemed to be pretty good at it. He could do all kinds of things in his various crowns. But hey, he seemed to be good at everything, didn't he? The blue crown certainly was different. It was easy to balance and it was well padded for protection. The earliest examples of the blue crown are found during the Second Intermediate period. But the majority of the depictions of the crown are actually during the New Kingdom and afterwards. So there's a reasonable length of time when it was used. Some Egyptologists believe it evolved from the lesser interesting cap crown, and I agree with this concept. I can tell you why. I think it might surprise you, or not maybe. It's actually all about the safety of the pharaoh. Let me start by explaining what the crown was made of, and then you'll understand why. The inside was made from a heavy, sort of matting-like material. It could have been a form of moss. It kind of looked mossy, but it was thicker and heavier than you'd expect moss to be. But it was some kind of dried out, heavy kind of matting material. But on the outside was a carefully shaped, woven crown, much in the same manner as the other crowns that we've discussed. So it was woven and shaped. The inside was also a woven crown, but it looked very much like the skull cap that we referred to earlier. The god Ptah wore one of these skull caps, so it's quite easy to see the general shape if you look at some of his statues. I'm going to try my hand at drawing what I'm going to describe in terms of what these war crowns were made of. Let's start with a piece of plant fibre, which we roll around into a ring, and we flatten that ring out. Then we get some really fine fibre that's sort of like cotton thin, and we create a bunch of it, and we push it through the ring. Next step is to pull it around the ring and then bunch it back together, so you've got the fibre going up through the ring, round, and back down the outside of the ring. So what it then looks like is kind of a little lifesaver kind of round thing with lots of strings around it. These things have to hold the three component parts of the crown together. So that outer layer, which is the shapely, beautiful crown that then gets painted the blue colour. The middle layer, which is that buffer layer, and the inner layer, which is the skull cap. The end result is the front looks like these little round circular disc things, and the inside or back of it looks like a series of soft knots. Let's take a closer look at some of these statues so you can get a feel for what it looked like. The outside was painted with some sort of blue chalky substance. The challenge was to create an item that was beautiful, lightweight, well, relatively speaking, stable on the head, and provide the pharaoh with some safety if they were to fall on their head or be struck there. As with the other crowns that I've discussed in previous episodes, it was shaped to cover the contours of the hairline. This is because royal hair, and to some extent other people's hair, was preferred that hair remain permanently hidden, especially in the royals, because hiding it from the people, it was too personal a thing to let your people see your hair. It was believed that magic could be done against someone if they were able to access some of your hair. The blue crown was usually adorned with the cobra at the front, and that was a symbol of protection and divine power. But I'm not going to talk about that at the moment. The use of the colour blue for the war crown was significant, as blue was a very difficult colour for any of the opposing factions to ever create, and hence its uniqueness made it even more stunning. Some theorize that it represented the Nile River, but I say no. It was a colour no one else could create. It stood out, and it was incredibly beautiful. But there's one more thing about it being blue, and this is really important. By wearing the blue war crown, the pharaoh was aligning himself with the god Osiris, the blue god. Even the design of the crown looks like a shortened, stylized version of the Atef crown of Osiris. It's sad that no crowns remain, but I guess it would be pretty unbelievable if they had, considering what they're made of. But as for the blue war crown, I can say it was incredibly beautiful, and it stands out as a testament to the ingenuity of this extraordinary civilization. Let's talk about the Nemes, and by default, the skull cap. Of all the headwear of ancient Egypt, the Nemes has got to be the one most easily recognizable, but it's not a crown. I know this series is supposed to be about crowns, but to omit the Nemes headdress would be negligent, as it is so iconic. It's even the piece of ancient fashion worn by the Sphinx and Tutankhamun. The Nemes, which was rather a large headdress, it extended almost like a cape. Even though it dates back to the Old Kingdom, some of the best depictions of it are actually from the New Kingdom. And this was a time of great prosperity, and you might say cultural flourishing. After the New Kingdom, the Nemes headdress gradually fell out of fashion and was replaced by other headdresses and various crowns. However, it's still considered an iconic and enduring symbol of ancient Egyptian royalty. So what exactly is it? Well, the easy answer is that it's just a striped, seemingly folded cloth headdress worn by pharaohs. Egyptologists accurately describe the ancient Egyptians as being incredibly skilled in textile production, and it's believed that the Nemes was made from fine linen or a kind of cotton cloth, dyed into stripes, stiffened with starch or resin, and then adorned with the decorative elements. From my perspective, although this view is partially true, it's missing a few of the crucial components. Firstly, it wasn't dyed, it was painted. And this form of painting doubled as starch. Secondly, it had an underlying base of a skull cap. So when removed, it sat completely as it looked when it was being worn. Thirdly, it had a metal component, and that metal component should have been found already by archaeologists. I would imagine they should be able to locate these things pretty easily, as it was significant ornamentation that allowed the snake, the ures, to sit so perfectly on the head. Yes, there was a woven fabric component, but this delicate fabric of the headdress had little, if any, chance of surviving, not just because of what it was made of, but also because even these items would be destroyed when a pharaoh died. Only the metal structure would be retained and passed on to the next generation, if it wasn't entombed with the pharaoh themselves. And this differs greatly from what the Egyptologists describe currently. But I'm hoping that as more evidence comes to light, then my description will eventually be recognized as being accurate. Now, I'm going to deviate slightly now and ask you if you see any similarity between this and this. So, the difference between the Nemes, or as some people say, the Nemes, and the olden day wigs of judges. Even with thousands of years apart, it strikes me that there is a link. Now, I'm guessing that the design of these wigs was inspired by the headdresses of the ancient pharaohs, whose power was unsurpassed in their time and who often acted as a judge for matters of great importance. And maybe there might have been a mason behind the design of these judges' wigs. Who knows? What do you think? Now let's have a look at some of the other royal crowns, the slightly more modern ones, like only 2,000 years old or so. I'm not going to discuss these in detail. I'm just putting up a few pictures, so it's basically for completeness. But you may be thinking, well, there are a few missing, like the Atef or the Hem crowns. But I'll cover those in a separate episode when I get to the god crowns. So that's it really for the royal crowns. And if you think I've missed anything, please let me know in the comments. And I just want to remind you this is all just my opinion. So I hope you enjoyed my episode on crowns of ancient Egypt.